During the Second World War, prisoner of war camps emerged across many different countries as a way to deal with the captured soldiers of enemy armies. Within the Third Reich, many prisoners of war were sent to concentration camps, where they had to put up with horrific conditions and brutal guards who would inflict violence for minor infringements of the camp's rules. Soviet POWs were treated terribly, for example, with many being executed and murdered by the Germans as Hitler ordered the Commissar Order, a death order that resulted in the executions of thousands of Soviet former soldiers. But within Britain, things were rather different for prisoners of the German Army, Italian Army, or other Axis forces who were captured. Today only a few former British POW camps exist and can be visited. A number are left in ruin. But how were Nazi and Axis prisoners of war treated in Britain? As you can expect, things across the English Channel were very different. So join us today as we look at what life was like in a British POW camp. Remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. As the Second World War waged on, a large number of prisoners of war were captured by the different sides. Some commanders and generals treated the prisoners with contempt as they slowed down their advances or got in the way of attacks, but inside of Britain, around 400,000 prisoners were held in different camps before the conflict came to an end. At their peak, different camps housed the soldiers across the country, and the experiences of those held inside of Britain were very different to other soldiers of other armies. But this didn't mean that the British were lenient or soft with Axis POWs, but compared to the prisoners in captivity inside other camps in different countries, the death rate inside British camps was remarkably lower. The German and Axis forces were treated in a humane way. As the Second World War began, the only Germans captured by the British were naval personnel and members of the Luftwaffe whose aircraft and planes had crashed within Britain. Rudolf Hess would be one such pilot who crashed within Britain, but he was treated differently and housed separately due to his high-profile career in the Nazi Party. The first prisoners held in Britain were the captain and crew of submarine U-39, held on the 14th of September 1939. The commanding officer, Captain Gerhard Glatz, became one of the longest-serving prisoners in British custody, and was released 7.5 years later in 1947. At the start, only 2 prisoner of war camps were established. These were Camp 1 at Griesdale Hall in Cumbria and Camp 2 Glen Mill in Oldham. Griesdale Hall was a huge mansion which had 40 rooms where officers would be held inside, and also 200 soldiers of lesser rank could be held within the grounds. Glen Mill was a former cotton mill that was much larger and held up to 2,000 prisoners of sergeant rank or lower. Privates who were captured usually ended up initially at Glen Mill, but in Britain there wasn't much need to create a network of camps, as the British had a policy of sending POWs to Canada. One reason for this was that it was virtually impossible then for POWs to escape back to Germany and to rejoin their war effort. Also, the fact prisoners of war were being housed in Britain led to a number of people being angry at them. Britain was already feeling the effects of the war, as rationing had been introduced, and many other necessities were being rationed. This meant that the British government didn't want Germans adding to the strain on resources and food inside of the country, so men were sent to Canada as soon as there was enough to be sent on a boat. Because of this, 9,000 POWs were sent to Canada by late 1942. But as the Allies achieved more victories across the various theatres, the problem of POWs became heightened, especially following the success in North Africa. The Axis surrendered in May 1943, and it led to a big problem of what the British and Americans would do with all the prisoners of war that they were forced to take control and possession of. 260,000 prisoners were absorbed by the Allies, and half of these were German, and the other half were Italian. It was agreed that any joint operation between the Americans and British would lead to the prisoners being shared 50-50, regardless of where they came from. But in Britain, things were already very strained with resources, and the British government asked the Americans to take their own share and another 130,000 prisoners. This was agreed as long as they could use them as a workforce within America. The prisoners belonging to the British were held initially in camps in the Middle East that were set up, and a few high-ranking officers were sent back to Britain. The Italians were sent to the UK, and they were held inside a newly built network of camps, and some of the POWs even had to make their own camps and bunks, which they would then sleep in, as the facilities had not yet been created. These workers were then mobilised, not to directly work in munition factories, but instead were put to work in agriculture and helped to produce more food for the people of Britain. But further successes following the invasion of Normandy and D-Day led to huge numbers of German POWs being captured and rounded up, before being then transported across the English Channel back to Britain. The usual rule was that those prisoners who had a surname beginning with a letter in the first half of the alphabet were sent to America from Liverpool. As the Allies captured more port towns in Europe, prisoners were usually sent directly to the States from these. Those with a surname in the second half of the alphabet would be transported to Britain, but were then taken to transit camps for interrogation and interview first, before they were then sent to the hundreds of established camps across the country. Many of these had been built by Italian workers, but as these were sent back to Italy, the Germans moved into their former lodgings. Prisoner of war camps were even established in foreign lands, such as Belgium, and the conditions in these were much harsher than those within Britain. It's likely that the guards who policed these camps had seen much of the crimes that the Germans committed, or that their treatment of the prisoners was influenced by the fact they had been fighting the Germans, so they were regarded as a staunch enemy. These camps eventually were shut down, and the prisoners were then sent back to Britain following the war by late July 1946. It was around this time when most of the German POWs came to Britain. However, what were the camps truly like within Britain? It's intriguing to compare the fatality rates of different camps established within different countries. In the Soviet Union and East and Southeast Europe, the conditions were far worse, and inside the Soviet Union's camps, there was a fatality rate of almost 35% for its 3 million German POWs. But remarkably in Britain, there was just a 0.03% death rate for the 3.6 million prisoners, which is crazy compared with 35%. This shows that the British camps were far safer and that prisoners were looked after in a better way. In the UK, German POWs were graded in terms of their Nazi sentiment and feeling towards the Nazi Party and Hitler. The British sought to find out the individual values of each prisoner and how ardent of a Nazi they were. The more pro-Nazi prisoners were taken to more stricter camps and were held with less freedoms than those who opposed the Nazi regime or were pressed into service against their will. The grades were Grade A or White, which was deemed an anti-Nazi camp, Grade B, which is where prisoner feelings were not as reliable or clear as Grade A, and Grade C or Black, which was for those prisoners who had Nazi sentiments. But the most ardent Nazis were kept in camps graded C+, and were kept under the strictest confines and rules. But the conditions inside of the camps within Britain were rather good. Some were seen as less strict as others, and one good example is of Eden Camp in Yorkshire. Here, the prisoners were allowed many more conveniences than at other camps, and the living quarters were seen as good compared to others. Those places dealing with more ardent Nazis would enforce stricter laws, such as curfews, and would aim to prevent certain prisoners moving around camps and mixing. Even before the Germans surrendered, many POWs were working as agricultural labourers, but after VE Day, all of the prisoners held in British camps were required to do some form of work. Most POWs worked on British farms, as there was a high demand for food produce at the time, and there was also a shortage of agricultural workers, as most had gone off to fight during the war. By mid-1946, almost half of the POWs were employed on farms, conducting different work. At first, groups of around 30 men would be taken and escorted to the fields, and would be kept under armed guard at all times, but as the time went on, following the surrender, the British allowed many different concessions for prisoners. Some were allowed to stay on farms where they worked, and many were allowed to almost live freely, being kept under minimal supervision. Some of the workers were even allowed to earn a wage from the farm for the first time since the war began, and prisoners would typically receive payment of around 1 shilling a day. This was seen by the government as pocket money for them to spend in local villages that they could visit, and also that following reparation, it could be used for them to begin their new lives. It wasn't much, but for many German POWs, it allowed them to obtain supplies when they were back home. There was, however, one element of work inside of Britain that could be considered much darker. There were a few occasions where the British put a very few number of prisoners to work on disposing unexploded bombs, landmines or ammunition that had not detonated. This was very dangerous work and was not permitted by the Geneva Convention, and the British justified this, saying that the rules of war were not valid in the post-war period, citing atrocities committed by the Germans as evidence for this. It is known that at least 3 Germans died in bomb defusal squads, but they were also used in other ways. In the winter of 1946, there was a number of bad snowstorms, and because of this the Germans helped to reopen the railways and roads, meaning supplies and goods could travel around the country. But inside of the camps, rules differed on the type of camp it was. Prisoners were allocated a certain amount of food each day, which consisted of bread and meat. The rations were collected by British soldiers and were then distributed by the cooks, who were POWs themselves, and they then prepared the food. Upon interviewing different prisoners, the British, before allowing them into the camp, often asked for their pre-employment history to see if they could carry out specific roles at the camps, such as doctors, dentists or cooks. This meant that German doctors could look after the prisoners, performing their pre-war duties, and it made the camp very efficient. There was constant running water provided, and showers and bathrooms were used. Many other facilities inside the camps included chapels, where many prisoners would go to pray on a daily basis, or where religious ceremonies were performed on a weekly basis on a Sunday. There were even music halls set up inside of the camps, and prisoners were encouraged to write their own plays and forms of entertainment where these could be performed. Some of these even invited outside visitors in to watch, and this was a space where prisoners could get some form of escapism from their imprisonment. Prisoners were even encouraged to establish their own camp magazines, which were screened first, and they were then given a weekly German language newspaper published by the British government called Wochenpost. This was a chance for them to see what was happening back home in Germany and around the world. Libraries were often important centres of escapism for the prisoners too, and these were inside. Here prisoners could borrow books, records and even films, which were shown inside of the hall. Lecturers were also invited to speak to the prisoners inside, and these activities aimed to allow the prisoners to have a sense of freedom of speech, which would help them develop after repatriation. Many of the denazification activities happened in this way. Some were even allowed to attend colleges established and obtain degrees while studying inside the camp. With regards to sport, many different teams such as football teams were set up, and fixtures were arranged against local teams and different camps, and many people would come to watch. In charge of the day-to-day running was a sergeant or orderly officers, but prisoner discipline was the responsibility of their own NCOs and officers. The majority did not misbehave because their imprisonment was seen as a relief from the conditions of war that they were fighting in, and there were very few incidents of prisoners being treated cruelly or poorly. The guards would carry truncheons in case something did break out and occur instead of their rifles, and many of the prisoners accepted what they were doing, and they knew they were being looked after well. Many were lucky to come to Britain rather than the Soviet camps, but checks did occur to see if POWs were in possession of banned items. Punishment was administered in the form of solitary confinement if there were any infringements of the rules, and this would have been tough, as the camps were considered very social. Each day roll call would happen to make sure there were no escapes, and the prisoners lived in their billets. These were huts where a number of POWs lived in together, but each had their own bed and were allowed to use different areas of the camp to relax. There was some living space inside the billets, as prisoners would play chess and cards inside them. After their day's work was done, the prisoner time was their own, and they did many inventive things. Some made their own musical instruments, and others wrote their own plays and performed them. Choirs would form of talented German singers, and musicians would form different bands and play to the British officers and their wives, and fellow prisoners also came to watch. One thing that was heavily monitored and checked though was postal mail that came to the prisoners. This was to ensure they weren't being fed Nazi ideas or lies by family members back home. Also, the British did not want the prisoners to find out if their family members had been killed, especially in Allied bombing raids, as this could have caused a significant degree of friction between the guards and prisoners. If this happened, prisoners could go on strike and disobey orders, and this would cause trouble. If a prisoner did misbehave, They were given a period of 7, 14 or 21 days in solitary confinement on a daily diet of bread and water, and this usually sorted things out. Conditions within the prisoner of war camps within Britain were very good. Many Italian prisoners who were cooperative and pleasant were allowed to go on their own for evening walks around the local villages, but were told not to speak or fraternise with the locals. This wasn't always kept to, as many friendships and romantic relationships were struck up between the prisoners and the locals. Many citizens liked them, but some did treat them with contempt and animosity, initially during times of war, but as time went on, feelings cooled. In late 1946, civilians were allowed to invite prisoners of war into their homes for Christmas and the festive period, which moved many of the prisoners. They had longed to feel like a family, especially during the holiday season, and this made them incredibly happy. By late 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, many of the restrictions were lifted and prisoners could leave the camp unescorted and visit local cafes, cinemas and churches. There was a ban on romance, but following the lifting of this, 796 marriages took place between British women and German prisoners of war. The point of treating the prisoners fairly in Britain was to re-educate them about the Nazis and about the dangerous political beliefs that gripped Germany. They had been brainwashed by Hitler and his government, and the hope was that re-education would lead to those prisoners being repatriated and to help form a democratic Germany. The prisoners were lucky in Britain, especially those who headed to East Germany after the war, living under Soviet laws and rules. Repatriations began for Germans in September 1946, and this was delayed after the POW workforce was used to help rebuild the country, including rebuilding bombed-out buildings, and they were also needed in the farms. Also, the German economy had collapsed, but a number of POWs were allowed to stay in Britain as civilian workers, and 25,000 men stayed after feeling reluctant to head back to Germany, seeing a better life for themselves in Britain. British prisoner of war camps were significantly better than camps found in other countries. The low death rate, coupled with the respect that they were given and generally treated with, led to a happier system for the POWs who found themselves there. They were given greater freedoms and were treated fairly, and were seen as a necessary workforce to help rebuild the nation. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.